I don't report immediately on everything that I read because I want to understand it well enough to know whether I think it's going to be a good thing or not. And I have to tell you, I've been tracking this for a little while, and I still don't know whether it's all that promising or not. Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam, and I've been living with multiple sclerosis for over 40 years. And again, I apologize. I think the lighting is a little weird today, but that's okay because you're not going to have to look at me for very long before we move on to other things. The topic for today is something called vidofludimus calcium, which purports to be a drug that might have promise in progressive forms of MS. And I totally agree, there's a great need there. But I am not convinced that there's anything that's groundbreaking or all that promising with this yet. I'll have you be the judge of it, though. Tell me what you think. I'm going to share with you an article for Multiple Sclerosis News Today about the clinical trials that are going on right now. And then we're going to hear from the lead investigator for vidofludimus calcium. And then finally, we'll hear from Dr. Brandon Bieber and get a sense of where he's thinking this is going and how promising it is. So let's go ahead and dive right in. This article is from Multiple Sclerosis News Today. It was published on September 11th, 2025. New patent covers progressive MS drug for patients in U.S. Decision should offer protection for vidofludimus calcium through at least 2041. Okay, well, we're going to find out whether that's a good thing for us or a good thing for the pharmaceutical company. Immunic Therapeutics will receive a new U.S. patent covering its experimental therapy, vidofludimus calcium, and some related molecules in people with multiple sclerosis. Titled Treatment of Multiple Sclerosis Comprising DHODH Inhibitors, the patent explicitly covers the use of the molecules in progressive types of MS, including primary progressive, or PPMS, and secondary progressive, SPMS, at doses ranging from about 10 to 45 milligrams per day. It's expected to provide protection in the U.S. through at least 2041, with the possibility of further extensions according to Immunic. Vidofludimus calcium is also in development for relapsing forms of MS, for which Immunic already holds patents. Allowance of this new key patent represents a significant advancement for our vidofludimus calcium program in progressive forms of MS and further strengthens its robust, multi-layered intellectual property portfolio, Daniel Vitt, PhD, Immunic's CEO, said in a company press release. Okay, so far we're seeing why this patent extension is good for Immunic. Let's hope that they're going to talk about why it's good for those of us who have progressive forms of MS. Testing Immunic's vidofludimus calcium. The new patent comes just a few months after Immunic announced top-line data from the Caliber Phase 2 trial, and there's the number, which tested vidofludimus calcium against a placebo in 467 people with PPMS or SPMS. The therapy significantly reduced the risk of 24-week confirmed disability progression, defined as an increase in Expanded Disability Status Scale EDSS scores sustained in a subsequent visit of at least 24 weeks later by 20%. That reduction reached 30% in people with PPMS, but non-active secondary progressive MS patients also saw a 15% lower risk of progression with the drug. That sounds good, but not great. The patent comes at a pivotal time, closely on the heels of our positive Phase 2 Caliber trial data in progressive MS. Vidofludimus calcium continued to demonstrate neuroprotective potential by delaying time to 24-week confirmed disability worsening, supporting its ability to slow disease progression in multiple sclerosis patients, Witt said. Given that 24-WCDW would be an acceptable regulatory endpoint of a pivotal phase 3 trial, we look forward to continuing to discuss the opportunity with healthcare authorities to determine next steps toward our goal of bringing this novel and exciting approach to patients with progressive forms of multiple sclerosis, where there continues to be a significant unmet medical need, Witt said. Vidofludimus calcium is also being tested in the ongoing phase 3 study ENSURE-1, and there's the clinical trial number, and ENSURE-2, and the clinical trial numbers listed there, which enrolled more than 2,000 adults with relapsing remitting MS and active SPMS. The goal is to show the medication can delay the time to a first relapse compared with a placebo. Results are expected in 2026. Vidofludimus calcium is designed to inhibit dihydroorate dehydrogenase, DHODH, an enzyme that plays a central role in activating inflammatory immune cells that drive MS, while also exerting neuroprotective effects by activating a protein called NURR1. Now, hear an interview with the CEO of Immunic Corporation, Dr. Daniel Witt.
Hello, you're watching Proactive. I'm joined by Immunic CEO, Dr. Daniel Witt. Daniel, very good to speak with you. You're after your second quarter results. One of the highlights is the promising results of your phase 2 caliper trial of vidofludimus calcium. Can you remind us about that?
Yeah, hi, good morning. Happy to be here today. I think it was a busy quarter, and as you said, one of the most important things was the readout of our caliper study. And this goes back years ago when we thought, how can we analyze the neuroprotective effect of vidofludimus calcium in patients, and specifically addressing the unmet need of patients with progressive forms of multiple sclerosis. We initiated the caliper study, and we're very pleased to see that with this study we have achieved a very profound reduction, numerical reduction of disability progression in these patients. So overall in this study, we have seen a 24% reduction of disability progression, of 24-week confirmed disability progression in the full ITT set of the study. And what also I like specifically is that more than 30% of the patients with primary progressive MS also had a lower risk reduction. So I think that basically confirms the mode of action of the drug and underlining the ability of vidofludimus calcium to slow down progression in MS patients.
Daniel, what does this data mean for vidofludimus calcium and MS overall?
As I said, it is important everywhere in multiple sclerosis. We need to stop progression. This is the key unmet medical need in these patients. And therefore, I think the caliper data, as I said, is important for primary progressive, secondary progressive MS, but also for relapsing MS, where we have the phase 3 studies ongoing, the ENSURE studies. Also, these patients will benefit from the neuroprotective features of vidofludimus calcium.
You mentioned the phase 3 ENSURE trials. I mean, you completed enrollment for both trials of vidofludimus calcium in relapsing MS. What's the latest there, Daniel?
Yeah, also a big milestone in the quarter. So we finally made it and fully enrolled the study. So we had 1,100 and 1,121 patients in the two ENSURE studies, respectively. So they are twin studies, now fully enrolled. So we now know that the study will read out next year. It's a big step. It's a huge study. All in all, 2,200 patients, that's a number. But it's a huge indication. There's a huge unmet medical need. And I think patients deserve new treatment options. And with this, I think we come a very significant step closer to the readouts.
Moving on to the phase 2 emphasis trial, you released new data in June. Can you recap what that revealed?
That also points to the same thing as the results of the Caliper study. So the question is always, to what extent can we protect patients from disability progression? And the good thing is that we were able to follow up patients from the emphasis study, which is years ago when we completed the study, and now some patients are already now on treatment for more than 5 years in the open label extension part of the study. So these patients receive 30 milligram of vidofludimus calcium for quite a long time. And I think the good thing here is that we learned that really more than 90% of the patients after 144 weeks of treatment are free of disability progression, which, looking back on historic trial and comparisons of other molecules, really makes it a very good activity, very convincing activity. And also the patients seem to like the drug, so a lot of patients staying on the treatment here. So the treatment discontinuation rate is really, really low. So we think that speaks also for the quality of the program and also for the perceived quality of the treatment from the patient's point of view.
Another highlight of the quarter, Daniel, you strengthened your balance sheet with 2 financings. So you are well positioned to take those trials forward, aren't you?
Absolutely. And I think in this market environment these days, it's a big success to convince investors to support the company, to believe in the Caliper data and believe in insured data, which we're generating, and the ability of us to bring that to the finish line, either alone or with a partner. And I think this capital raise was important to bring us in that situation, to be able to go forward with these developments, specifically in completion of the phase 3 studies in relapsing MS.
Daniel, I hope you'll continue to keep us updated on your progress. Thank you very much for taking the time today.
Yeah, always a pleasure. Thank you, Stephen.
So you're welcome. Dr. Daniel Witz, the CEO of Immunic.
And finally, let's hear from Dr. Brandon Bieber.
Let's take a look at the investigational multiple sclerosis drug vidofludimus calcium, purported to be a 1-2 punch, having both anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective effects. Currently in phase 3 trials, we'll take a look at the results of phase 2 trials and see how effective it is in both relapsing and progressive MS, along with the potential side effects. Vidofludimus calcium is a simple small molecule depicted in the upper right, being developed by the small pharmaceutical company Immunic. It may have 2 distinct mechanisms of action. One is to inhibit the enzyme dihydroorotate dehydrogenase, or DHODH, similar to the mechanism of action of the MS drug Aubagio. And this drug would be taken as a once-daily pill. Aubagio is believed to be a modestly effective medication for MS. However, it has a relatively low risk of serious infections. It's possible vidofludimus may have less off-target effects, in other words, more specificity for the target protein, and could potentially have a lower risk of liver injury, though that is unproven. What's interesting about this drug is it may actually have a second important biological effect, which is to activate nuclear receptor related 1, or NER1, which may have some neuroprotective effects, and this drug is in development for both MS and ulcerative colitis. The phase 2 trials in both relapsing and progressive MS are completed, and there are 2 ongoing phase 3 trials in relapsing MS called ENSURE-1 and ENSURE-2. So vidofludimus blocks the enzyme DHODH involved in pyrimidine synthesis as shown in this pathway. Pyrimidines are nucleotides, components of DNA, cytosine and thymine, and this salvage pathway specifically is important in rapidly dividing cells, such as the lymphocytes, active B and T cells involved in inflammation in MS, but also other rapidly dividing cells, such as in the gastrointestinal tract, which is why you can get loose stools as a side effect with Aubagio and vidofludimus, and also the hair follicles, which is why you can potentially get hair loss with this class of drugs. However, it turns out there's also a separate de novo pathway. So this salvage pathway is very important in rapidly dividing cells, but resting lymphocytes like memory B and T cells can use the de novo pathway, in other words, synthesizing pyrimidines from raw components, and so it's not as toxic to those cells and doesn't have that profound of an effect on the immune system. And in fact, Aubagio is not associated with a significant increased risk of infections. The other potential mechanism of action is to activate NR1, which is also known as NR4A2, and this has important neuroprotective effects. It may allow neurons to survive in certain toxic environments. It also alters gene expression and may reduce the expression of pro-inflammatory genes in microglia. These are cells of the innate immune system which may be involved in smoldering multiple sclerosis and progression independent of relapse activity in both relapsing and progressive MS. In animal studies, it's been found that mice deficient in NR1 have decreased production of the neurotransmitter dopamine and have symptoms of Parkinsonism, in other words, a movement disorder typical of Parkinson's disease. There are also rare genetic variants of NR4A2 in humans, and this can cause developmental disabilities and Parkinsonism. And by the way, there are other existing drugs that stimulate NR1, including the malaria drugs amodiaquine and chloroquine, the second one you may have heard of due to the research in COVID-19, and the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug glafenine in the same class of medications as ibuprofen. So let's take a look at the clinical trials, and we'll start with the EMPhASIS phase 2 trial in relapsing remitting MS. There were 268 participants aged 18 to 55, and this was a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial, and they compared 3 doses of vidofludimus, 10 milligrams, 30 milligrams, or 45 milligrams once a day versus placebo, and they added the 10 milligram dose later as an amended protocol. The study was done in Bulgaria, Poland, Romania, and Ukraine, and it was a short study, only 24 weeks. Here are the results in terms of active new gadolinium-enhancing lesions that take up the contrast dye due to breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. You can see the 10 milligram dose was ineffective at stopping these lesions with the same rate compared to placebo, but the 30 milligram dose reduced lesions that were active by 76%, and the 45 milligram dose reduced them by 41%. In terms of relapses or clinical MS attacks, there were no statistically significant differences between placebo and the 3 doses of vidofludimus, though there were few relapses in the trial overall, and it was a short trial. For the placebo group, the annualized relapse rate or relapse rate per person per year was 0.52. For 10 milligram vidofludimus, it was 0.28. For 30 milligrams, it was 0.38. And for 45 milligrams, it was 0.47. They measured changes in disability with the EDSS scale. This is Expanded Disability Status Scale. It's a 0 to 10 disability scale used in MS research, and there were no statistically significant differences, although essentially most people were stable in this short trial. They looked at changes in EDSS, and for placebo, it was plus 0.07, so they got worse, but only a little bit worse on average. For the 10 milligram group, they got worse by 0.06, and for the 30 milligram and 45 milligram group, they were essentially stable, 0.01 and 0.00 change in EDSS. This is confirmed disability worsening. These are people who worsened on the EDSS, and then when they were evaluated later on, they still were worse, so it was confirmed. It wasn't just day-to-day fluctuation or temporary worsening with a relapse. And again, there were no statistically significant differences. 4% were worse with placebo versus 2, 1, and 1% with the 3 doses of vidofludimus, though it's hard to demonstrate differences in disability because many people with relapsing MS are stable over a 6-month period anyway. They looked at neurofilament light chain, a biomarker in MS. This is a breakdown product of the central nervous system and correlates with CNS injury. It's associated with MS relapses and is weakly correlated with progressive disability in MS. They looked at a comparison to the placebo group of the 3 different doses of vidofludimus, and you can see the 10 milligram dose was ineffective at reducing neurofilament light chain. The confidence intervals interact with 0. However, the 30 milligram dose did reduce neurofilament by a statistically significant amount, and the 45 milligram dose was perhaps a little bit more effective. So overall, the 10 milligram dose didn't perform well, and the 30 milligram and 45 milligram doses were perhaps about equal. In the ENSURE 1 and 2 phase 3 ongoing trials, they chose the doses 15 milligrams and 30 milligrams to study. I'm not sure the 15 milligram dose makes sense since the 10 milligram dose didn't look good. Seems like a waste of time in my opinion. In terms of the side effects, the overall rate of reported events with vidofludimus was pretty similar to placebo. There were rare serious adverse events. All were in the 30 milligram group. One person had squamous cell carcinoma of the cervix, one person had a bone fracture, and someone else had a kidney stone and nephritis, in other words, a kidney infection. But the investigators thought these could all be unrelated to vidofludimus. There were 3 people who stopped vidofludimus, all in the 45 milligram dose, 2 for elevated liver enzymes and 1 with rash, and the liver abnormalities resolved spontaneously after stopping the offending agent. So this may be why they wanted to avoid the 45 milligram dose in the phase 3 trials. There were no deaths reported in this study. So now let's move to the CALIPER trial, which studied progressive MS. So they looked at both secondary and primary progressive MS, and there were 420 participants, 268 with SPMS and 152 with PPMS. And it was a 120-week or slightly more than 2-year study with an 8-year open label extension phase afterwards, which is ongoing. So we'll get some really good safety data from this extension trial eventually. They chose the higher dose, vidofludimus calcium, 45 milligrams once daily versus placebo, age up to 65, which is very important. Many people with progressive MS are older than 55, and there were 70 sites in North America and Europe. And on the EDSS disability scale, you could have an EDSS up to 6.5, meaning a walker or bilateral support, such as 2 crutches, was needed to walk. So you could have a little bit more disability, which is great because we need to study medications in people with older age and more advanced disability because people in this category tend to have less options right now. And they wanted to look at people with less inflammation to really prove this drug works in real progressive MS. So you had to have no relapse in the last 24 months. And of course, prior disability progression, or else maybe you don't really have progressive MS. And the primary outcome was whole brain atrophy. Here are the characteristics of people in the trial. The median age was 51, 64.7% were women. Unfortunately, 98.7% were white, so we don't have any data really on ethnic minorities. The median body mass index was 25. The median SDMT, this is symbol digit modalities test, a measure of cognitive function, was 35, which is somewhat low. Average in this age group is probably around 50 to 60. So some people in the study had some degree of cognitive impairment. And the median EDSS was 5.5, which is having the ability to walk short distances without assistances, without a cane. But many participants did have the requirement of a cane or a walker. And the percentage of people in the study who had gadolinium positive or active lesions was 16.3%. In other words, the minority, and that was 6.8% of people with secondary progressive MS and 17.8% in people with primary progressive MS. And notably, this is less than the proportion in the Oratorio study, the pivotal trial that led to the approval of Ocrevus for primary progressive MS. So this is sort of a less inflammatory cohort than the Oratorio trial. So if this medication worked, it would be very impressive. And it did work a little bit. So those who were randomized to vidofludimus had 20% less disability progression compared to those who got placebo. In terms of the absolute numbers, 16.2% who got vidofludimus had confirmed disability progression versus 20.3% who got placebo. So in absolute terms, it was a 4.1% difference, though this is only over a roughly 2-year period. Now, in terms of subgroup analysis, if you looked at specifically those with primary progressive MS, it was a little bit more effective, 30% reduction in disability progression. Although, for reasons beyond the scope of this particular video, my opinion is that PPMS and SPMS are the same disease. I personally wouldn't make a distinction. Now, you may say maybe the efficacy of the drug was driven by that inflammatory activity, those gadolinium-enhancing lesions. But looking at specifically people who did not have active lesions, there was a 29% reduced disability progression in those that did not have active lesions. So that's a good sign that maybe there really is something non-inflammatory going on with that Neur1 receptor. Now, this is not a published trial. I don't have all the data, so I don't have the serum neurofilament light chain data yet, but they did release a midpoint analysis during the trial, and at that point, there was a 22% reduction in neurofilament light chain in those who got vidofludimus compared to placebo. Let's move to the MRI outcomes. So the primary outcome of the study, reduction in brain atrophy or brain shrinkage, was negative. There was only 5% less atrophy in those who got vidofludimus, and it was not statistically significant. So you could say this was a negative trial, although reducing disability progression is really more important to people with MS than making the pictures look better. I'll note that in the Hercules trial, the primary progressive MS trial for the drug tolebrutinib, the Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitor that could get FDA approved later this year, it was also relatively ineffective in reducing brain atrophy, also a roughly 5% effect. Now, they looked at specific areas of the brain, and in terms of reducing thalamic volume loss, it was 20% effective. They also looked at T2 lesion volume, the change from baseline, and those who got vidofludimus had slight reduction in the lesions, minus 0.22%, whereas those who got placebo had a gain in lesions by roughly 3%. So it seems to have some effect on MRI. In terms of the side effects, the overall rate of adverse events was roughly the same with vidofludimus and placebo. For serious adverse events, it was a little bit more, 8.1% compared to 6.5% with placebo. Some reported events include pyelonephritis or kidney infection. Although there was one case with treatment and one case with placebo, there were 2 people who got vertigo and none with placebo, which wouldn't be an expected side effect. And no people had significant liver injury. I don't have the data on the liver function test if there were milder elevations of liver function tests. We don't have the full publication, and there are a lot of missing p-values on those MRI lesions. If I do get the full publication, I'll post it in the notes below. We could also assume the side effects with Aubagio, the established MS drug, which also affects the DHODH enzyme, could occur with vidofludimus, such as elevation of liver function test, loose stools, usually not severe, or nausea, thinning of the hair, though again, usually not severe. You can also get neuropathy with this medicine, not numbness due to central nervous system injury as an MS, but actually separate damage to the peripheral nerves, and infections have been reported, though it doesn't seem to be a significantly increased risk. So the reaction to the press release of the CALIPER trial was actually negative. The stock went down by about 23%. 20% after that statement. And that's probably because the primary outcome, brain atrophy reduction, was negative, and the overall reduction in disability progression was only 20%. However, my opinion, if they could prove in a phase 3 trial that this drug reduces disability progression in 60 and 65-year-olds with progressive MS, even by 20 to 30%, if there's a low rate of side effects, that still does have value, just my personal opinion. And I'm not convinced that the NER1 receptor has anything to do with this. When people have done genome-wide association studies, there's actually no association of gene variants of NER1 and MS. All the risk genes of MS really have to do with the immune system. So this could be a red herring, though it's certainly interesting, and I'd love to see a phase 3 trial.
Okay, I don't know what to think. The article kind of raised some questions. I wasn't really sure. The interview with Dr. Vitt, well, okay, I could see he's wanting to address an unmet need in multiple sclerosis, and that's very commendable. And then Dr. Bieber, after listening to his video, he seems to share some of the same skepticism that I've been expressing, or at least subconsciously, I've been just kind of mulling over. It's why I haven't really talked about this much in the past, even though I've seen articles about vidofludimus calcium for the last year or two now. I just don't know what to think about it. It might be a benefit. I do like the idea that the safety profile is pretty good. I'm always open for that, because no matter how good a drug is, if there's a high risk of some bad side effect, I'm not as interested in getting involved in it, because I've been down that road with liver enzymes and all that stuff. I just don't want to go there. But this one may be a little bit milder in that way. So that's all to the good. But the results did not seem to show an incredible positive effect. And I suppose that with anything that we take into our bodies, if we're going to accept a risk, we also want to be assured that the benefit will more than outweigh that. And I guess that's where I'm at right now. I'm just not sure that the benefits outweigh the risk. Even though the risk may be fairly minimal, the benefits don't seem to be groundbreaking. So what can I say? There are other things out there, like firelimab, I'm more excited about. But in the interest of just letting you know what's going on in the big world of MS, I felt like I should put this up there. Let me know what you think. Is this something that we should pursue, that you're happy that is being pursued? Do you think that it looks at MS in a new way? Do you think it will add something to our arsenal of treatments for progressive MS? But that's all I have for you today. So in the meantime, until my next video, please do continue taking really good care of yourself, and I'll see you again soon.